Hello and welcome to a special bonus episode of the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne. And today we're excited to be joined by Irina Dumitrescu. Irina Dumitrescu is a professor of medieval literature at the University of Bonn, but she also has a secret life as an essayist. She's particularly interested in how food reflects culture, how people use craft and creativity to survive hard times, and the positive uses of imperfection. Her essays on food have been nominated for the James Beard Foundation's M.F.K. Fisher Distinguished Writing Award and been reprinted in Best American Essays 2016, Best Food Writing 2017, and J. McInerney's Wine Reads, a literary anthology of wine writing in 2018. Welcome, Irina.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Thank you for joining us. I am super curious about this, that you are both a professor of medieval literature, and a very fine one at that, and that you've also taken this interest in food writing. How did you start getting interested in food writing? Was it something you grew up with? How did you get into it?
I don't think I really grew up with it, but in graduate school, food writing was often my guilty pleasure. I probably didn't even think of it in that way at the time, but I would always pick up Ruth Reichel's memoir or histories of particular foods, anything in the whole range of food writing. And so this was something that I never thought of doing myself because I really didn't think of myself as a writer. I thought of myself as a scholar. And it happened by accident that I wound up writing something to do with food. And the story was that at the time I was working in Dallas at Southern Methodist University, and my then boyfriend, who's now my husband, was at Columbia teaching in the German department. And he saw in the newsletter for American German departments the announcement of the new Braunfels Wurst Festival, which is the annual salute to sausage of South Texas.
Wow.
He said, you have to go to this. And I said, okay, I really have to go to this. And my colleague, Willard Spiegerman, who was the editor of the Southwest Review, and I told him about this, he said, if you write about it, I'll publish it in the Southwest Review. And so I bought a dirndl online, got two friends to fly in, one from Seattle and one from the Netherlands. She was passing through for a conference, everyone with her dirndl. And we got in the car and drove down 4 hours to New Braunfels, Texas, and we attended the Wurst Festival.
Wow.
Was it tasty?
It was surreal. It was so strange. It was so strange. It was weird.
So your first writing was a kind of reporting almost.
Well, it started as that. It started as me as a short piece in which I was making fun of it, basically. And I sent it to Willard, and Willard's a brilliant editor, and he gives very short edits. And he said, who is this person? Why do I care about her? How did she change? And I took that edit and I went back, and what came out was a completely different piece, which was a personal essay about immigration and fusion and the ways that people improvise food on the margins as part of their new identities. And that's what he published in the Southwest Review. And that was my first food piece.
That's so neat. It really resonates with something that Chris and I were talking about, the way in which food writing is often also about people, communities, cultures, sometimes connected to travel writing. Chris mentioned sports writing. Food writing is doing very different kinds of work.
I'm actually not that interested in food writing that's primarily about food.
Yeah.
I love food, but yeah.
Related to that, I was going to ask something in our main episode when Chris was talking about food writing. He said, "Oh, do you like food writing?" I started talking about cookbooks, and he said, he drew my attention later when we were talking to, that was kind of weird to think about cookbooks and food writing as somehow being the same thing. And on my shelves, I noticed last night they're all mixed up together, and it hadn't dawned on me that was idiosyncratic, that everybody didn't think of it that way.
I think cookbooks are food writing. I absolutely think cookbooks are food writing. If you think about it, if we were to look at medieval recipe collections, we could read a lot about the culture through those recipes, and we wouldn't necessarily need a narrative around them.
Yeah.
I should say that my food writing books are also on the shelf in the kitchen with my cookbooks. But when I think about what do I sit down to read for food writing, I definitely have cookbooks that I have mostly for reading rather than for cooking out of. And I always love it when a cookbook contains historical contexts or, more thoughts about how the recipe was developed, or not necessarily personal reflections, although sometimes that's nice, but more than just the bare list of ingredients, something that really gets you into the mindset of what this meal is. Because I learned how to cook out of books. I didn't really grow up in a family where I was taught to cook or where that was super important.
Same here.
So Irina, you didn't grow up in a cooking family.
No, my family cooked, but they didn't really teach me how to do it.
Ah.
A little bit, around the edges, a little bit, but I wasn't systematically taught how to cook the things that we made.
Oh, yeah, my experience was totally different. So my cookbooks are kind of palimpsested, partly because of learning to cook from my grandmother, like mostly German or Hungarian food. But then also from my mother-in-law, one of the few things we had in common was we were both really interested in cooking. So I learned to cook Iranian food or Persian food from her. So one of my cookbooks in particular from the 80s, The Food of Life, is heavily overwritten because almost any recipe in there that she also cooked, there were variations and differences. So it's all totally scribbled up. And again, I thought everybody does that. I didn't realize, it didn't dawn on me that people's experience is so different. Because it makes that makes it a different kind of book. Like it's a cross between a notebook and a regular book, right? It's not.
I've started writing in my cookbooks for that reason. I think when I do cook out of them, I just want to remember that I did do it and I didn't go online for a recipe. But it's quite useful. This weekend I made a curry and I saw I had made it before and it turned out, and I write the substitutions. And it's really kind of a nice record. But it's funny because I think the food writing world maybe still really has to get around to the reality of there being a lot of people who didn't grow up cooking and that it might want to speak with them too. And I come from a family of multiple women who learned to cook late, and because they worked. So I think both my mom and her mother really only started cooking seriously for themselves in their late 20s. Their own mother would bring them food in the meantime, so long after they were married. So in my family, that's actually not unusual that we start to cook late. And I only had my own kitchen when I was 28. But I still feel that it's different, and so much of the food world is really aimed at people who have a high level of comfort and proficiency, and is very scornful of people who don't, which I find upsetting.
Do you think it's actually aimed at those people, or do you think that's a performative kind of stance? Like that we assume competence, we assume experience, and that's like, I don't know what to put it, like a rhetorical position?
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah,
which is creepy.
Well, usually the person who's writing a cookbook has a different level of comfort with the skills of the kitchen than most of the people reading it, and they might not realize how different that level is.
For me, the ultimate expression of that is, Rose Levy Birnbaum's Cake Bible?
No.
I know it.
Oh, yeah. And it's like, it's food porn. It's like baking porn. Like the pictures are amazing and the recipes look incredibly luscious. And I actually, tried to make a few of them, but it's like food science. She talks about like the chemistry of what she's doing. And like, it's just, I don't know. I see it as kind of this aspirational, absurd kind of cookbook food writing because it's a very specific kind of voice in there.
Also, if you look at some of the sort of modernist, Heston Blumenthal type cookbooks, the equipment that you require to have to make these foams and so forth are completely unattainable. So you're just reading this, fantasizing about a world in which this was possible for a home cook.
There's actually something really amazing about someone who can write either a cookbook or any kind of instruction in cooking that makes it feel doable, right? Mm. I think that's, and in a way, Mark Bittman is a bit of a genius at that, because How to Cook Everything is that kind of a book, right? You make a recipe out of it, and he's already made it clear you can improvise, right? He's already made it clear that you can use it as a base for your own inventions. And I think that's very liberating. Oh, what's a really neat cookbook? Do you know the Flavor Bible?
No.
I do know that. It's I don't own a copy, but I've had friends who own it, and it's a book that I need to get at some point.
Such an awesome book. It basically just lists of flavor combinations.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and it's based, if I remember correctly, they had quizzed some chefs about their favorite flavor combinations. So they also have they use type to demarcate whether the combination is a classic combination that lots of people would find good, whether it's a somewhat frequent combination, or whether it's a more unusual combination, but that's chefs with taste would say is delicious, even if it's unexpected. You could take the ingredient you have and go look and see what else you have, and then start to experiment with those things. But it's just the ingredients.
And presumably it would have something to do also with like different kinds of cuisines. Like I remember learning to make Persian food, and there's like weird things happen. So for example, you might make a stew that has either beef or lamb in it, and one of the spices you use in there is cinnamon, which, if you're accustomed to Western cooking, feels weird. But once you're accustomed to it, totally makes sense as a combination.
Lebanese cooking does that too. Yeah.
And I mean lots of cinnamon, like tablespoons full of cinnamon, right? That you cook with the meat. So yeah, that's a really neat approach, because it aspires to give you a feel for flavor as opposed to a sort of prescriptive set of instructions.
It's like giving you the paints instead of a paint by numbers.
Mm.
So one of the things that you mentioned that you're interested in is, as you say, the positive uses of imperfection, which is also something near and dear to my heart. And I wonder if you could go into that a bit more. Like, what exactly are you looking at? What are you thinking about with that now?
How many hours do you have precisely? We'll be here in 5 years. I hope someone brings food.
Well, you've written on bad food, failed food, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
But that's just the beginning. That's the tip of the iceberg.
That's how it started, actually. It started with food. And it started with the fact that in my 20s, when I was reading all this food writing, that was also the heyday of blogs. Oh my God, I feel so old saying that. Blogs were still popular, and people made careers off of blogs back then, and often very unfancy blogs. But in my late 20s, so the late aughts, already the blog scene had become somewhat professionalized, right? It was no longer this homey sort of, let's trade recipes. Look, this is how I make kvass. Why don't you try it at home too? Bad photograph from someone's kitchen, but useful recipe, right? It had stopped being that, and it had become this polished product where people would devote a lot of time. It was usually people who didn't have day jobs, right? So they would take photos, nice photos of their food by daylight, and everything looked very polished and very hyper-produced. And those were the people who were doing well with blogging. And that really annoyed me partly because I couldn't do it because I always had a day job. But partly also, I think, just because it felt like it wasn't accessible anymore. It was off-putting when it already looked so perfect and everything was arranged on the wooden board or the slate and out in sunlight on the balcony or in the garden. And I remember in my first year on the job, I would get home late in the evening. It was already dark. And if I cooked, the food was lit by a yellow bulb, and I was happy if it was there. It never looked that way. And I just found that so depressing and off-putting. And I thought how this whole genre had changed in a way that was no longer really welcoming if you were a normal person. And so that's where my frustration began. And then I would talk to people, one of my best friends with whom I gained enormous amounts of weight in graduate school, who just ate everywhere. He wouldn't cook because it wouldn't turn out the way it would in restaurants. So he didn't want to spend all the time and money doing it when he could just buy it. And I thought that was kind of sad because he loved food and loves food as much as I do.
Yeah.
So that was the seed of my frustrations with the ways that the aspirational aspects of food culture were actually something that would turn you away unless you were very motivated to cook for yourself, right?
Mm-hmm.
So now that we're in the sort of post-blog era, has there been any kind of response to that in food writing in general?
I think somewhat. I think there have been more articles in the past, let's say 7 years or so, that have reflected on the reality of cooking. Even a few weeks ago, there was one making the rounds about how the difficulty of cooking or the labor of cooking is not so much in the cooking itself. It's in the mental work of planning you have to do beforehand.
Oh, yes.
Which is so true, right? And I think that conversation is happening in a small way. and there have been all kinds of reactions, right? The sort of trends I was talking about in my bad food essay, I think were kind of reaction to that perfectionism. So you have people photographing food disasters or outrageous food or things like that. But on the other hand, it's gotten worse because Instagram has pushed perfectionism in lots of areas.
And also, like in the real world, there's been this incredibly fascinating, I don't know if you see this in Germany or not, in Canada and in the US, Blue Apron, and then there are these other kinds of like vendor things. And what they do is they'll deliver you a box and it has all the ingredients you need and it has a very beautifully produced recipe card. I don't have it myself, but my kids have it.
They don't sponsor the show yet. So.
Oh, sorry. So you could bleep it out if you want to, but you know, because it is kind of horrifying. But also, it's making people cook at home who otherwise wouldn't be cooking at home. And the reason it makes it so easy is not, I think, as most people think, because the ingredients are there prepackaged, though that's part of it. It's that there's the recipe card that tells you what you're having. The mental labor, which is huge, of figuring out what to have for dinner, is done for you, right? And that's so interesting.
So I had a funny experience on the weekend. I guess we're not talking so much about food writing right now, but This is the culture of food. I went to a Thermomix evening. Have you heard of Thermomix?
No.
Oh, yeah, the gadget, the very expensive gadget.
A very expensive gadget that's very big in Europe. And I hadn't even heard of this until a few years ago, but it's huge here. It's all done through Tupperware style parties, right?
Oh, wow.
They have stores. They don't sell the device in their stores. I actually just passed the company store today. They will not sell you their device in the store. They do it through representatives.
Uh-huh.
And it's basically a very fancy mixer chopper device, right? It costs 1,300 euros. It's a lot of money. And I realized the thing about it, so the newest model has a screen, has a sort of mini iPad kind of screen on it. And it hooks up to your wireless and it gives you access to thousands of recipes, each of them with a photo, and you press on the recipe you want, and it gives you step-by-step instructions, one by one. And you put in the ingredients in the object, in the bowl, and it weighs them for you as you put them in. So it'll say put in 30 grams of olive oil, and you do it, and you make no decisions in the whole thing, right?
Wow.
You can change it. It's totally in your power to put in more olive oil or more salt or more spices or do whatever you like, right? But I realized this is actually, I think people want a guru, right? They want a teacher because it's actually just a mixer.
Wow.
That can also heat at the same time, so you can make a hollandaise really easily. Okay, a hollandaise is not worth 1,300 euros, right?
You have to write about this. This is so fascinating.
I actually went so I could write about it. I thought I was so tired and I really had lots of other things to do, but I thought, okay, I'm going to write about this. But it just was so fascinating for me because it doesn't make the best variety of any given food, but it'll make sure that it always is successful. If you follow the instructions,
right,
you don't fail. It will never overcook it. It will never burn it. You might have to take something out and bake it, and then you could go wrong. But as long as you follow the instructions, you will have an edible meal, right? There's no more failure. And I think people, especially people who are not wild about cooking or don't see it as a creative outlet, and who really just want to get the food on the table every evening.
They want that comfort.
Yeah, they want the instruction, the equivalent of somebody standing next to them and saying, okay, now you do this. Okay, now you do this, right?
That, I think, is one of the things that can make food writing particularly appealing, is because you don't even have to do that. You're reading about somebody else doing all the steps and walking through it, and you're just sort of you're sort of with them for the journey, but you don't actually have to make any decisions or do anything about it.
I wish I had a vocabulary to talk about what it is that makes a writer able to inspire the reader with the feeling that they could do it versus a writer who just gives them the pleasure of reading about it. I mean, do you guys have books that you felt really just made you want to put down the book and go and try something in the kitchen?
Well, we were talking about Fisher, right? And her writing, at least in How to Cook a Wolf, ranges widely from the very unappetizing and even horrifying sludge, or Aunt Gwen's cold shape, to things that I actually folded the page, not because I wanted to talk about it in the episode, but I'm like, oh, I'm going to try to make that. Like there's an interesting polenta recipe. And so there were some things that were like giving me that kind of prod. But there were other, that's what I thought was one of the things extraordinary about her. There's the whole spectrum. There's the revolting recipe you would never want to be in a position of having to make. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there's a totally aspirational food, which is just fantasy food. And that I think is an incredibly interesting topic. I would love to talk about that. And then there's the stuff in between that's totally doable. You're like, oh, maybe I'll make that on Tuesday.
Maybe the trick is to offer that whole range so that someone can enter in where they're comfortable.
Yeah, that makes sense.
John Thorne does this. Have you heard of John Thorne?
No.
He's in New England. I forget if he's in Vermont or in Maine. He writes a newsletter, and he's published a number of books, I think, based on the material in the newsletter. He's one of the most beautiful food writers around. Right? And he is absolutely dogged, but also realistic in his approach to food, which means that he will take chili or cooking beans or something like that and try out all the different methods and give you a very firm opinion on which one is the best method. But then he will also write these beautiful little essays that are about something small that you can do that's very good or that makes your life easier, like taking a small cast iron pan and crowding as many garlic cloves as will fit into it and putting lots of olive oil and salt on top of them and roasting that. And that is a very good thing to do.
That does sound
You
good.
just take these. I did it once and I still have a picture of it, because it was such a beautiful thing. And I had all this roast garlic and it was glorious and beautiful. I think that's the kind of thing where you really just like, okay, yeah, I'm gonna shove a lot of garlic cloves in a small cast iron pan. I love this idea. He has this rant against dishwashers where he says, by the time you've already rinsed the dish before you put it in the dishwasher, it's half clean already. You might as well just wash it. And I always think of that essay when I fill up the dishwasher.
It's neat you were saying earlier that so there's food writing that inspires you to cook or, makes you think about what you might actually do. But you said also that some of the food writing you find most interesting is where food is a means to another end, to talk about something totally different. Can you talk more about that? Like, what are some examples of that kind of writing that have really struck you or really inspired you?
I think I'm most interested in food writing that explores something uncomfortable, right? And right now, I have a few books in mind. One of them is a book I actually recently reviewed called The Bread and the Knife. The author's name is Dawn Derjal. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it. Has too few vowels. And she has a sort of alphabet of food, but the essays are not really about food. They're about life and relationships and the ways they break down. And the food serves as a symbol or as a key to the memory, and sometimes as a contrapoint to the memory. So I think she did that very beautifully. And she has some recipes in there. I think she has some recipes in the book. I never like to cook the recipes in books. I really don't like when books have essays with recipes in them. I want them to stay in their category. But it's a beautiful book. I think she was a cookbook editor, but she really just knocked it out of the park with that one because the essays are so memorable and they're different lengths too, and they echo beautifully.
That sounds lovely.
Yeah, I really recommend it. Right now I'm reading Medium Raw, Anthony Bourdain's book.
I haven't read that one yet.
I'm in the middle of it, and it reminded me of how great his writing is.
Yeah, I really I know people have different views, but I really enjoyed Kitchen Confidential. I know
loved
that's the go-to one. No. Yeah.
He's the most macho of macho food writers, right? I don't think it gets more testosterone.
It's sad, right? Yeah.
I don't think that's sad. I really am happy that it's not just M.F.K. Fisher and her style.
No, right. I guess what I mean is that there's this incredibly performative, strong masculinity in these books, and and he's a complicated person. I don't know. I think of him as a little bit of a tragic figure. I don't know.
He is.
Yeah. One of the things I noticed, I was peeking back at the book this morning, and I'd forgotten that, there's the text, right? That's printed like a regular text. And then there are these as if they were written on addenda later, like second thoughts and like, later writing. And I'd completely forgotten about the speech. So, for example, there's this one chapter called Apocalypse Now, right? And at the end of it, he has like as if it were handwritten, but it's actually printed. I had an awkward meeting with the shadow years later. I felt a bit guilty about this chapter. He had clearly been hurt by it, but that's the way it was then. And, it's a little bit like in Fisher, the way in How to Cook a Wolf, she's got these in the 1951 edition. It's not that she's updated the 1942 one. There are these bracketed editions. And I made me wonder, like, is this a thing that shows up in food writing? This, again, palimpsested kind of quality that you write it and then you go back, but you make the patches visible. I don't know.
I think there's a self-consciousness to writing about food, which has to do with people's guilt about the self-indulgence of it, right?
Oh, wow.
And what struck me about this Bourdain book, which I started reading last night and I really couldn't put down, was that he does the performance and then he immediately comments on the performance. Right?
Yeah.
So he has this one essay in which he's using very crude sexual metaphors to talk about food, and he does that a lot, and it's never just sex, it's sex with a whore, and the moment after that he will say I use this kind of metaphor a lot, and he breaks it apart, right? And he shows you how coarse it is and how it is a kind of a trick, an easy move, right? And part of it is that he's very conscious of the fact that there's something a little bit weird about him in particular and about writing about food, right? Mm-hmm. So he has this beautiful essay I was reading in which he talks about these exotic experiences of eating really fantastic meals in places most people will never go. And in the middle of that essay, he asks, why would I tell you this? Right? What do you get out of imagining me in these places where you're not likely ever to be, And is that maybe a little bit cruel? And those are my words for it, right? But he asks the question, what is actually the point of this exercise? And then he continues with it and does it more.
Yeah.
So I think he was very conscious of what he was doing.
But I think the point of that is kind of obvious. Like when I read writing like that, I don't want to go to those places. That sounds difficult and uncomfortable. And
do it for me.
He's doing it for me. He was the sort of person who would enjoy that kind of challenge and enjoyed meeting people like that. Whereas I'm a homebody. I just want to stay home and read. And I'm glad that there are people like him that exist that can do that, I suppose. But, I can enjoy their writing, but I have no desire to recreate those experiences or to use that as a guidebook.
Oh, I do. I'm madly jealous.
Oh, that's good.
But what's funny is in one of his scenes is set in a place I've been, and he eats a very simple dish that I fell in love with in that place, and that my husband also fell in love with. And so that's the scene I read out to him over breakfast today, and we both smiled because actually we have gone to that place, and it really was that great.
Oh, good! Oh, fantastic!
Oh, can you read a little bit of it to us? Do you have it?
Yeah. Can I read you the moment, the scene?
Please do.
Yeah, please.
So this is in a section of the essay where he just goes from one place to another and describes a meal in each. It's another one of those agriturismos. They're all over Italy, little mom-and-pop joints, for the most part thrown up quickly in farmhouses, private homes, on picnic tables under the trees, serving out of hearths, field kitchens. This one's in Sardinia, and what's on your plate is the simplest thing in the world, spaghetti alla botarga. Pasta, tossed quickly with local olive oil, through which a clove of garlic and a hot pepper have briefly been dragged, and the local salt-cured mullet eggs, which are the specialty of the region. There's no explaining why this is so good. It just is. The salty and frankly fishy flavor of the eggs cuddles up to the more subtle taste of the durum pasta, the tiniest notes of heat from the pepper, and the sharp yet lush tang of freshly pressed extra virgin olive oil. You wash this down with a sneakily compelling canonau, the local red whose rough charms have lately got a serious hold on you. You don't care about the big Bordeaux anymore, the high-maintenance Burgundies with their complex personalities. The Baron Rothschild could back his car up to the door, trunk full of monster vintages. He's drunk and offering them for free, and you would decline. Here? Now? Mopping olive oil and a few errant fish eggs from the bottom of your plate, swilling this young and proudly no-name wine, there is nothing you would rather be drinking. When you ask the proprietor where the wine comes from, He points to an old man sitting in the corner, reading a soccer magazine, a cigarette dangling from his lips. It came from him, he says.
That's wonderful.
It's great.
It's wonderful. I think, and you have that Bourdain move in the middle, right? Baron Rothschild is coming up with this, is backing up the car and offering you all of his alcohol for free. You say no.
There's so much to say about that passage, like the richness and the sort of sensuous quality of it. Like you said, the classic Bourdain move, Also, the extent to which it's about the food. Like it starts with the food, but it moves into the wine and stays with the wine, which is interesting. Did that strike you too?
I think what strikes me is it's actually the most simple dish that you can get there, right? It's a very poor person's dish, but he's good at bringing out the charms of that. And that's something I love about him, is that I think he seemed always to be more about flavor than about pretension. And he was also someone who really cared about the people who cook the food, right? So he often talks about the kind of pretentious fine diners who have lots of money but would never really want to meet the Mexican guy who cooks their food, right?
Yeah.
They want to meet a French chef with a double name who seems really fancy, right? But they don't care too much about the many human beings in the back who work really hard and who actually prepare the food.
Is that something that food writers are turning more towards these days? Or has it always been there? Thinking more about the people who are making the food, the sort of the systems and the snobbery and whatnot that prop up a lot of fine dining and fancy eating.
I think that's something that's changed a lot for the better. Probably 10 years ago, a lot of food writing was still focused on appreciation, right? On how to get the best version of a particular dish. And in the last 10 years, we've really seen a shift in terms of what some publications are putting out. Eater, for example, is one publication that's very good at this, at looking at local traditions, at farming and labor conditions, at immigrant communities and the kinds of foods they make, right? So that is changing a lot for the better. Lucky Peach did this too.
And there's also been an interest out there in recovering practices of earlier periods when either periods of want, like the Depression or whatever, immigrant experience where people were living, in very, very tight budgets, grandmother cooking and so on. Like, there's this YouTube channel. I think that's where you found the egg preserve recipe, right, Chris? That's about reconstructing some of those strategies, not just recipes, but strategies for managing in hard times. I wonder to what extent it's part of like larger ways of thinking about the environment and the climate and the conditions we live under. And if you're a person who lives currently under conditions of plenty, it seems to me there's a greater and greater awareness that may not be a permanent state of affairs. I don't remember noticing that like 10 years ago or 20 years ago.
I've seen some videos which are about cooking in the forest, right? Have you seen these videos where somebody will have maybe just one knife and very rustic equipment and will make extremely complicated and attractive looking dishes? But I think people watch that as a kind of fantasy relaxation thing. I'm not sure that they're really looking to learn the survival skills involved in them. It almost seems more like a curiosity.
Yeah, maybe. I guess maybe it's on my mind partly because, in Fisher, it seemed to me like it wasn't just about remembering nostalgically a time when things were really tough. It was about talking about what do you do? Like when you, as Chris put it, when you're under circumstances where you have very little choice, not just choice of what to eat, but your choices are circumscribed in almost every way. And that, one way of thinking about that is imagining that as being safely in the past and a thing we don't have to think about. Another way of thinking about it as this is a wolf that comes back to the door and will come back to the door.
I do think some of that is largely a kind of fantasy, though. Like even people who stockpile for the coming apocalypse, right? Like they're doing it in this fairly impractical way. Fisher makes jokes about this as well, but like it's about a fantasy of having control when things are going to go out of control, and it's often not really fully thought through as to what this is actually going to be like. Maybe it will effectively give people a few extra days after things go bad, but it's not it's not a long-term solution. It's a projection of fantasy, and I think that might be true of those going into the woods. The ones that I've seen of cooks going into the woods are a lot fancier than what you're describing. So, but I think there's still a fantasy of, okay, well, if civilization collapses and I'm need to go to the woods and survive, at least I'll maybe have remembered that video I saw once. It's doable, and therefore I can do it, which is a weird fantasy to have, but I understand why people would turn to it.
Yeah, maybe. I remember as a child in my grandparents' basement, they would be fascinated by the jars and jars and jars of preserved foods. Like, there were like tomatoes and prune plums and peaches and different kinds of vegetables and all this stuff. And like, for me as a child, it was just like, it was visually beautiful. And then it was only years later that I kind of grasped that this was, I think, partly how they were brought up, but partly a way of responding to having lived through a time of want. That this was not an option. And like, it wasn't like they pathologically stockpiled food, but there was always food. There was always canned goods. And I remember getting to the age where it dawned on me that, those stories of the wartime and right after the war and the state of the basement were not unconnected, that these were related. So in some ways, I think you're right. It is absolutely a fantasy, but for others, and these are past generations now, right? It's real.
Oh, yeah. No, I definitely think that there are people who grew up where that was how you had to preserve food. If you wanted to have vegetables and fruits in the winter, you needed to preserve them. There simply wasn't a supply chain to allow it. And then that habit may have continued long after it was necessary because it was a habit. And maybe you also you liked the taste of the food after it had been preserved for a bit. Like, that's perfectly reasonable. But that seems different from people who are interested in dealing with a future crisis that is going to radically upset how they live in the world now.
I think it is too. I'm not sure that people who, at least judging by my family, I'm not sure that people who have experienced food restriction or food shortage necessarily, I think those are actually not necessarily people who would watch videos of rustic forest cooking.
No.
Usually it's enough to have seen it once, and they might watch Food Network videos in which people are cooking all kinds of wild and wonderful things. But that's why I think the rustic forest cooking is a bit of an escapist fantasy. They don't show you how to hunt the animal. That would be the useful thing, how to hunt and take apart the animal. I can cook it, right? But how do I kill it? How do I catch it and kill it? Mm-hmm. That's really the skill I need in that moment, right? Not if somebody brings me the ingredients all chopped up in a beautiful knife and a fire.
Do those? I mean, I've never looked for those kinds of videos. I assume they must be out there. How to hunt. There must be hunters' videos, but they're probably not connected with the cooking videos.
Oh, you know what? They probably are. That would be interesting. How to skin a squirrel.
I don't think we're ready for that yet.
I had an undergrad at Yale told me how once. He said, I grew up in the South. We know how to do this. And he explained it to me in great detail. So I know.
Wow. Well, are you going to write that essay?
I've never done it. I think I'd probably have to do it. And I like squirrels too much. And I really don't want to kill and skin a squirrel.
No, that's true. That's true.
But if it came to it, if it were between the squirrel and me, I'd skin that squirrel.
I think you would win that fight, yes.
I would win that fight.
Did that also include how to catch the squirrel in the first place?
No, he didn't. I think you were supposed to shoot it, but yeah.
Oh, well, fair enough. So I'm curious what other books or writers you would place in a kind of food writing canon. We picked up M.F.K. Fisher, but what are some of the other books that you would consider the great books of food writing?
Oh no, don't ask me that question.
Okay, I don't have to. I can rewind that if you want.
No, I think it's funny because I think I love reading about food and about food history and the world of food, but I think I tend to focus more on my frustrations with it, and so those are the things I tend to remember. You know what? There's some great food history. So I think her name is Lizzie Cunningham's book Curry.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not an expert in the history, right? So I can't judge all of the facts, but it's a wonderfully told and organized book about the history of curry around the world. And if I remember correctly, it's arranged by dish, right? And so she really gives you a sense not just of particular culinary cultures in India and Pakistan, but also the histories of how they came to be, how certain dishes came to be iconic in other places, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that was a fabulous book that I really loved. Okay, now they're coming. Abe Openkar, Fried Butter. Abe is someone who I think is not known as much. I knew him through online Facebook food groups. And then I discovered he'd written this book and I ordered it. And it was absolutely luminous. It was such a gorgeous, soulful
Fried butter?
Fried butter.
Wow.
Mostly not about food. I mean, always a connection to food, but more about human relationships. And that was really one of the books where I thought, oh, wow, this is possible. I'm just so happy. He's a funny character. I wish he would just stop posting on Facebook and write another gorgeous book. I tell him that now and then. And then, Fuchsia Dunlop's Shark Fins and Sichuan Pepper is one of the food memoirs that I think is really how they should all be, in that she talks about a number of trips to China and how she learns to cook certain aspects of certain regional cuisines. But she talks about the culture a lot, and especially she describes how Chinese society is changing over if I remember correctly, the 80s and the 90s. So it's about food. There's a lot of food in it. There's a lot of food history and a lot of food culture, but you also get an incredible picture of a place, not from someone who traveled there once and wrote about it, but from someone who spent a lot of time there and then had multiple trips and saw it changing. So that to me was a memoir where I put it down and I thought, this is how you do it, right? You give me all the food I want, but you also give me history and culture and the memoir aspect and how you changed and how the place changed. And yeah.
So for you, like some of the food writing that moves you the most is where it's kind of not necessarily lined up with travel writing, but some of the same things that travel writing does, it's doing. Like it's both giving you an account of another place, another environment, and also telling you about what happens to the person who travels or who has those experiences, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's what I mean when I say I like food writing that's not primarily about food.
Yeah. I also like food writing that's not maybe not primarily about food, but I tend not to be so drawn to the that kind. I'm really drawn by things that are like very self-reflective. That's why I love Laurie Colwin's home cooking and a couple other books she did so much, because they were about at homeness, but in a way that really defamiliarized it. So a lot of different things happen in that kind of writing.
I think I also I like learning about the histories of how particular foods came to be. So I'm probably going to be quite happy if I get a little bit of history in there too.
I loved your currywurst essay for that reason. It just gives you such a beautifully focused glimpse into that whole cultural scene.
I did a lot of research for that essay.
You absolutely did.
Which is funny because it's a little fun little essay, but I actually read everything I could find about currywurst at that point.
I love it. No, I love it. I love that one. I mean, and also, what it's called, My Father and the Wine, I think. That's just, I mean, that's such an amazing piece. I love that piece. I just went back to it not too long ago. I love it.
It's very much a food gone wrong piece, right?
Yeah, but it's so, I want to say vivid, but that's the wrong word for it. Like, it's just so bodily, right? It just takes you in so many different directions in terms of shared experience. It really does something. That must have been very difficult to write.
It was the easiest thing I've ever written.
Wow, that's amazing.
Because it was one of these experiences, some pieces you write and some pieces are dictated.
Yeah, yeah.
And that piece was dictated. So I just tried to keep my hand moving across the paper as quickly as I could. And it came out very close to the shape that it's in. And I did small line edits and then just left it alone. But I had told the stories for a long time. I had told the anecdotes. So in a sense, I had already shaped them. But when I came to write it, I didn't even feel that. I still don't feel I wrote that piece.
Oh, wow. What an extraordinary experience. And I think you were wise not to fiddle with it too much. You said you did line edits, but you didn't do a whole lot else. I think that was brilliant. Oh.
No. And its editor also just changed one word. That was it. But that, I think, is also one of these things where it starts with the reaction to the trend for doing, make it at home yourself, do it yourself, authenticity, and so on.
Yeah, you think it's doing one thing, right? And then...
But that's where I think sometimes food trends really don't connect to people's lived reality at all.
Uh-huh.
And it's nice to say everybody should make their own pickles, but how many pickles do you have to make before they taste good? Right?
That's right.
And how much space do you have to have in your home, and how much investment do you have to make, and how much time, right? And might your kids prefer that you spend that time with?
Yeah.
Well, I think that's about all the time we have for today. But it's been absolutely lovely and delicious talking with you.
Absolutely.
This was fun.
Yeah, and thank you for offering a few other suggestions for places where listeners might want to go next if they want to read more interesting food writing.
I'm excited to read Thorne, especially, you mentioned. He sounds wonderful.
I think you can find some of his essays online as well, but he also has the books and the newsletter. He's very good.
He sounds great.
We'll also have links to your work as well, of course, including the essays we just mentioned. So we will link to Irina's website, and you'll be able to get in touch with her there if you want to talk with her about something. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm, or we're on Twitter @thespouter. And of course, we'd always love to hear from you. Show notes with links for all the things we've mentioned in this episode will be at megaphonic.fm/spouter/20b, and the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So thank you again, Irina, and until next time.
Yeah, thank you. And until next time, we'll see you again at the Spouter-Inn.